Hey, this is Major Johnathan Poarch of the Alabama National Guard, and if you want to know what's happening in information security, you should be listening to the InfoSecSync podcast with my good friend, Nick Thomas.
If you're looking for insight into the vast world of information security, then you're in the right place. Welcome to the InfoSecSync podcast, the only top-rated information security podcast committed to helping you enhance your cyber skill set. Listen in on conversations with world-class information security thought leaders, subject matter experts, authors, and more as we exchange ideas, best practices, and discuss the latest trends, threats, strategies, and solutions for your success. So get ready to get in sync with your host, Nick Thomas.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the InfoSecSync podcast, where we keep you in sync with the ever-changing world of information security. I'm your host, Nick Thomas, and today we're talking to another member of the Alabama National Guard who was also an information security officer for a major bank and a managing partner for a security company. So he's a cybersecurity professional with over 20 years of technical and operational experience in both civilian industry and the U.S. military. His recent emphasis on cybersecurity in healthcare and cyber incident response, he truly enjoys difficult problems and the satisfaction that comes with resolution. And lastly, he firmly believes that the Star Trek universe has more insightful plots and more richful developed characters than the Star Wars universe, and welcome a spirited debate on this topic. So welcome, Mr. Johnathan Poarch. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Nick. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So your current roles right now, you're currently an ISO for a commercial bank in Birmingham, Alabama. You're also a major in the Army National Guard and a team chief for Alabama's defensive cyber operations element and owner of Scorpion Security. So
Yep.
with all those jobs you have there, I guess you're a very busy guy, and seems like you're a cyber subject matter expert.
Well, I am very busy. That's certain. My wife, much to her chagrin, I gave up sleeping a few years ago, so I can keep all the balls in the air.
So with all these difficult jobs you have, how did you get into cybersecurity?
Well, so that's a fair question, and so most modern day cyber guys have a story of how we got here. I was an IT professional, the traditional server, storage, virtualization guy for several years, about 15 years here in the Birmingham area. And at one of my previous employers, we suffered a pretty significant breach. And although I was familiar with the typical InfoSec, make sure that we're patched and that we have good password policies, ultimately I don't think that I was a cybersecurity professional at the time. And I got a trial by fire as we started bringing in law enforcement agencies and some regulatory agencies to help us out in the incident response. I got a baptism by fire of incident response. And so that kind of started my civilian transition. And simultaneously, the United States Army was implementing the cyber branch officially as a branch of service. And so historically, cyber had always been a subset of intelligence and or a subset of signal or communications. But for the first time, the Army was creating a distinct and separate cyber branch. And that just kind of coincided with my civilian transition and, kind of resulted in a simultaneous transition both in the National Guard and in the civilian world.
Wow. So that trial by fire on an incident, that's very crazy to think about doing that, even though I've been through incidents. So I was actually trained on incident response, but to not be trained and to go through it.
Yeah, it's a very sobering experience.
Yeah. So prior to doing that, were you always in IT?
Yeah. So, starting off in college, I was a computer guy, not because I really had a passion for it. I love problem solving and I love the challenge of it, but ultimately in college, at least, it was really lucrative. And that kind of evolved into me pursuing my interest in hobbies and passions. And, you fast forward 20 years later and I'm still, and a problem solver and an engineer at heart.
So since you've been through IT and now you've evolved into cybersecurity, InfoSec, what do you think the difference is? Or what would you say the difference is? Or is there a difference?
Oh, gosh, so there's a significant difference. And so, being a member of IT is to provide operational support, right? We are here to make sure that whatever your business unit is, whether it's a hospital or a bank or the United States government or a military unit, can perform their mission. And how do we leverage technology to accomplish the organizational goals? That's kind of the fundamental role of IT. And then the fundamental role of cybersecurity is how do we protect that technology so that we can accomplish the organizational goals. I've used the analogy often that, cybersecurity is using technology to influence technology or using technology to defend against, being influenced by other technology, as opposed to, electronic warfare, which is using physics to influence technology. So the physical mediums that we communicate through or that the systems use to operate. But, IT would be, by my definition of using technology to accomplish those operational goals, which is very different than defending it.
Very interesting. What's your current MOS in the Army?
So in the Army, I'm a 17 Alpha, which is a cyber warfare officer. Again, cyber warfare has been a relatively new formal creation in the Army, coming into existence only in 2016. I was one of the first officers, already being a major. There's not a clear transition path at the time, for how do we make cyber majors. The Army was more focused on how to make cyber lieutenants that can then, grow into captains and captains into majors and so on. Mm-hmm. So I came in at a very interesting time where my peer group were, just civilian professionals who entered into the space and with very little formal training and very little Army doctrine to rely on. So I was actually the first 17 Alpha in the state of Alabama. I'm still the senior 17 Alpha in the state, and I likely will be till I retire. Just because as I, progress and matriculate closer to retirement, I have no peers, at least in the state.
How many 17As are there?
So it's a growing population. The Army is continuing to make purebreds. Currently, there are only 22 cyber majors that are fully qualified in the National Guard, and I'm one of those. Soon to be promoted as lieutenant colonel, the number will drop to about 18 fully qualified, cyber lieutenant colonels. So, as I matriculate higher, it's a smaller population.
Okay. Was there anything you had to go through to make a 17A?
Yeah. So, again, at the time, the Army had a really immature process. So it was just basically you submit a packet to a board, and that board, is impaneled at some smoke-filled back room at the Cyber Center of Excellence, and you really don't know who those people are and what their experience are. So your packet just has to, have enough force and enough strength to convince this nameless, faceless panel that will never actually meet you in person that you're qualified. Now the process has matured since then. And there's still a packet, but it's now with more defined requirements. But ultimately, what it comes down to is self-determination. And as an officer, you have to make the decision that this is what's going to happen and that you're going to accomplish this. And you'll apply to the board, and if the board rejects you, then you'll apply again. Certifications certainly carry a lot of weight in that. So for me, I went out and I got my CEH, my Certified Ethical Hacker. I got my CISP. And I got my CASP, which is the CompTIA Advanced Security Professional, just to kind of get the three best of breeds that I could capture from DoD 8140, mm-hmm. which is the regulation that governs certifications for technical professionals. You have to have a top secret security clearance. As part of my later operational roles, I had to get a polygraph. So yeah, it was a relatively arduous, daunting process. And, I often talk to young officers or enlisted soldiers that are wanting to branch into cyber, and they, they just don't know where to start. And they're like, look, man, there's still not a lot of precedence, and some of it's still self-determination. You just have to, start chiseling away and make that packet as strong as it can be and submit it. And if you get rejected, submit it again.
So I know in the civilian world, there is a serious shortage of cyber talent. Is it like that in the Army as well?
It absolutely is. So yeah, the military suffers from the same problems that the civilian industry suffers with. You spend time and energy investing in young leaders to make them cyber professionals, and then they get fully trained and they get fully qualified, and either they move on to another assignment within the military or they exit the military for civilian opportunities. That's a struggle, across the board. And I heard in your last episode, speaking with Jeremy Leisure, the conversation of, what happens if we train people and they leave versus what happens if we don't train them and they stay.
Right.
It's a very difficult decision. And so having a good cyber professional in the military is very similar to having a good cyber professional in the civilian world. It's kind of I equate our resume to a 3-part little triangle. And part of that is going to be certifications. And although I don't think certifications are an ends to a means, I think that certainly they can help be used as a tool to make sure that there's an established baseline of knowledge. And the better we can educate people in the same conversation through standardization, then the more we'll all be speaking the same language. You have formal education. I know a lot of technologists don't believe that they need a college degree to be competitive, but I would counter with the fact that college degrees make us well-rounded individuals, and whether that's an associate's degree or a certification program or a trade school, I think is up for the community to decide. But ultimately, I think that formal education has value in making us all, well-rounded and forcing us to interact in a common language. And then the third part of that resume is really your experience. And that's one of the things that, a lot of people that are getting into, especially in the military, they want to shortcut that, right? They don't want to get a job at a help desk somewhere and pay their dues. They're looking to join the military and, in 2 or 3 years, be a fully bred cyber professional. But just like in the civilian world, sometimes you just have to start at the bottom and keep trudging along.
So you are the team chief for Alabama DCOE. So is the DCOE a cyber protection team?
So it's not. So the cyber protection team is a 39-man team with subordinate elements that can deploy independently, and they have a number of capabilities. But ultimately, they're doing instant response at the behest of the United States Army, or the United States military rather. Cyber protection teams are found all throughout the service. The DCOE is the Defensive Cyber Operations element, and each of the 54 states and territories have their own DCOE that's been assigned to them to help them defend DODIN, which is the Department of Defense Information Network. So as opposed to a CPT, which is a deployable unit that can go anywhere in the world and do instant response, a DCOE is a localized formation that deals with protecting the government network here at home.
And also, it says you're a first CPT commander. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so cyber protection teams were new to the Army again, and they were really new to the National Guard. So about the time that I converted over to the cyber officer, the state of Alabama was awarded a cyber protection team for the first time, along with downtrace units in Tennessee and Kentucky. So it was a unit that spanned 3 different states, and they were looking for a commander. And it was interesting that, I happened to be the only 17 Alpha in the state, so kind of made sense. So I got the pleasure of most majors don't have the opportunity for a command. Commands are typically found for company captains and for battalions as lieutenant colonels. So I got the rare distinction of being a commander as a major, as well as my commands as a captain. So huge opportunity, huge honor, a lot of challenges, but we learned a lot as a formation. I learned a lot, professionally, as both the cyber professional and as an Army officer.
That's awesome that you did that. I want to pull the thread a little bit. What we talked about earlier on getting into cybersecurity and how people don't want the help desk job and coming into the military. What is your experience or knowledge on certifications versus experience versus education?
Well, and again, I think that it's a three-part conversation, right? So I think the perfect candidate has all three. For an entry-level person, maybe that means security plus and a help desk job, and some time at a junior college or something like that. For a mid-level, maybe that means a master's degree and a CISP and some time in management. I think that each position is going to be a little bit different, but I think that triangle, strengths in one corner of that triangle can certainly overcome weaknesses in another. So without any formal education, but great certifications, I think that those things kind of push and pull. But ideally, you have a good mix. I will say that and I have this conversation with people often. They say, well, I know people with a college degree that don't know what they're talking about, or I know people with a CISP that don't know what they're talking about. But I would also counter that I know a lot of professionals that have been doing this for 20 years that don't necessarily know what they're talking about either. So I think that it's dangerous to judge an entire population of, people with certifications or people with education or people with, experience by, your relationships with a few. Interestingly, I read an interesting article by Paul DeSouza, and I don't know if you know Paul, but he's very active there nationally in the capital region. But he posed kind of the same three things that I've been espousing for years, but he added a fourth corner in networking and contacts, right? Because ultimately, sometimes it does come down to who you know, and I think that working your tail off somewhere and doing a good job pays dividends in the fact that people recognize that, and those recognitions and those relationships can benefit you down the road. I've certainly been the beneficiary of mentors over the years, and I think that that's really important. And that's probably something that we emphasize a lot in the military that the civilian world kind of loses sight of, is that formal mentorship relationship with people that have already been where you're trying to go.
Right. Yeah, especially with people coming to commands and going, you sponsor them and you show them the ropes and mentor them through their job and their career.
Yeah, certainly.
Let's talk about cyber and the Army versus the National Guard.
Okay, so that's an interesting conversation. So, in the Army, and I know that, again, you and Jeremy talked about this last week, or in your last episode, rather. The Army is very good at a lot of things. And when you're talking to a career soldier, an active duty soldier or sailor, airman, or Marine, it doesn't really matter. They have a career spent doing that one thing. And particularly in the Army, we are very model driven. So, you'll do this assignment. So, for example, as a lieutenant, you need to be a platoon leader and then an XO. And you're promoted to captain. You'll go to staff, and then you'll come back for command. And there's a very regimented model to that, as opposed to the National Guard. And again, you and Jeremy spoke about this, where you might have someone who is an instant responder. You might have someone who is a police officer. You might have someone who is a medic. I had an E5 truck commander in one of my previous units that was a plant manager for a multi-million-dollar steel mill. That guy had tremendous leadership capabilities and problem-solving capabilities that you just don't find in the typical E5 in the Army. So I think that uniquely in cyber, the Guard and the Reserves brings a disproportionate skill set to our active duty counterparts. And I personally lived that out through my participation in Task Force Echo, where a couple years ago, as a member of the National Guard, we deployed to the D.C. area and supported our cyber and U.S. Cyber Command in a real-world mission, the largest National Guard cyber deployment in history. And our task force, which is all guardsmen with a handful of augmentees from the reserves, had unbelievable capability that the active duty just, not that they're incapable of producing it, but it's far less diversity of skills because we have guys that have been systems administrators and they've been storage administrators and backup administrators and they're plant leaders and they're CISOs and they're CIOs, as opposed to an Army formation where you're going to find a guy who's been doing fundamentally the same task or the same family of tasks throughout his career.
So we find the same thing in the Navy. As I'm in the Navy Reserves, we have people with phenomenal backgrounds that are regular enlisted, but yet they're a CIO or a CISO of a company or a vice president in cybersecurity somewhere doing great things during the week. It's just crazy.
Absolutely. And, even on the DCO, I have an E5 who's a serial entrepreneur who started and successfully spun off multiple businesses. I've got a guy that works for the largest healthcare provider in the United States as one of their senior incident responders. I have the ISSM, or the Information Security Manager for the state of Alabama, that works on that team. So we have just tremendous talent that is disproportionate, for their rank and their role in the military. But, they obviously bring those skills with them when they put on the uniform. So it just makes us incredibly diverse and, quite frankly, humbling to be a part of that team, much less to lead it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, being that we're both civilian and military, we have to comply with a lot of things.
Yeah.
The whole security versus compliance. So let's hear your take on your civilian industry versus what you're doing in the government. What standards are you having to meet there?
Well, and so you mentioned in my bio that I have recent experience in healthcare. Now I'm in banking. Those are very different regulatory environments, but ultimately, compliance is compliance. You're given a framework or a body, and then you have to work within that. So in healthcare, I have tremendous experience with HIPAA. Within banking, it's FDIC and PCI. Within the government, it's FISMA, which is the Federal Information Security Management Act. And now, more recently, CMMC, which affects government contractors that are doing business with DoD. And so all of those have different standards, they're different frameworks, but ultimately they provide a compliance language that is common for that industry. Now, you did bring up compliance versus security, and I want to be very clear, those are very different things. We find all the time compliant organizations that still get breached because they had fundamental risk. And you can be, you can be secure and still not be compliant. So as the ISO for a civilian bank, that's a fine line I have to walk. I have to keep the regulators and the auditors happy because, there's regulatory risk. If we're found to be non-compliant, it doesn't matter how secure we are. We're facing fines, or we're facing, the impediment of our business and operations. And the same thing goes for the government, right? I'm sure you see this in the Navy Reserves, but every couple of years you'll have a compliance, this big all-encompassing compliance audit, and everything becomes about, passing the test. And security, unfortunately, sometimes takes a back seat to that regulatory effort. Mm-hmm. But they're both important, right? Compliance is very important because it creates those standards and it creates a repeatable process of known conditions that we can operate within. But at the same time, we can't focus solely on compliance. We have to address our actual risk, and at some point, spend our resources where, we can spend $30,000 making something compliant, or we can spend that same $30,000 reducing our risk and, assuming some regulatory risk. So it's a good balance, and it's all about communicating with your leadership and explaining your situation and not getting micro vision and focusing mm-hmm. on one problem set and forsaking the others.
And of course the standards we have to go through, such as the RMF or CMMC NIST standards, we have to lock boxes down for and so forth. So yeah, we've got to use those frameworks and take care of that operational risk, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in order to do that, we need people, we need resources.
Yeah, we do. And so, you hear that often. I know that you and Jeremy talked about it again in your last episode, but ultimately, we never have enough people. And there's always going to be a war between convenience and security. And so I use this analogy. My wife hates locking her car. She finds it terribly inconvenient.
I hope you have a garage, right?
We do, actually. And that's something that, we've talked about over the years. But, when we first got married, she would just, leave her car unlocked. And I was like, honey, that's not safe. And she's like, yeah, but, I don't want to lock my keys in my car and things like that. And we can look at the evolution of, just the car, right? So the car was generally, we credit the German engineer Benz with inventing the first automobile in the 1880s. And for several decades, there was no security whatsoever. Cars were just, you just parked them wherever. And it wasn't until 1911 that Bosch created the first keyed ignition, where you needed a key to start the car. And that brought security, and that's great. But, it also came with what happens when you lose the key. And so for the first time, people were really inconvenienced, and they had poor adoption rates of these keyed ignitions because people didn't want to lose the key, so they just didn't use it at all. And it wasn't until the 1920s that we had the first locking car doors. And then not until the 1990s that we had the first, chipped ignitions, which, of course, we all know if you have a modern car and you lose your key, it's really expensive, and you have to go to a dealership to get those chipped keys replaced.
Yeah.
So, progressively we can see, just in that simple little, silly analogy, how more and more security in our automobiles has resulted in less and less convenience. We start off with, we have to keep a key to crank it. And now we have locking doors so we can lock our keys in our car inadvertently. And then we have chipped keys that, once you lose them, they're really expensive and hard to replace. But we're getting more and more secure, but we're getting less and less convenient. So part of the problem as Americans is we crave our convenience, right? We crave our independence, and we just fundamentally bristle at rules and constraints. So that creates a challenge to cybersecurity, both in the military and in the civilian world. We see every time the technologists put more controls in, we see leadership, make moves to make them less restrictive and more convenient. So yeah, we need more resources. We need people with fundamental training, more, better cyber hygiene at early ages. And we need a cultural shift away from, some of the convenience and towards more security.
That sounds good. What do you think about all the IoT stuff that we have out there, including Alexa, Siri, always on, listening?
So, oh gosh, I'm a victim like everyone else, right? I love my gadgets and my devices, and
right.
Everyone's got a tablet and a cell phone and a smartwatch, and I wear Bluetooth enabled hearing aids, and my threat surface continues to grow just like everyone else, and we have Alexa and we have smart TVs, and it's only going to continue to grow. So I think that we as cyber professionals have to we have to learn how to deal with the technology, but we also have to learn how to deal with the psychology of having those things around us at all times. I use the analogy a lot. I treat my Alexa like I treat my kids. I don't say inappropriate things in front of my kids that I don't want them to hear. And I don't say inappropriate things in front of Alexa that I don't want her to hear.
Or learn, right?
Or learn. That's right. Yeah. So, you have to, at some point, you have to deploy some wisdom and discernment and say, hey, I'm going to make a deliberate effort to have a technology-free zone, or I'm going to have a deliberate effort to have a safe space, or whatever. If that concerns you, then, you just have to make those efforts. But every single one of us, my gosh, I bought my dad a new cell phone last week, and it had 5 cameras on it.
Oh my gosh.
5 cameras and 2 stereo microphones. I was like, good Lord, if that were ever to become a sensor, he's got wide angle and telephoto, and the capabilities of compromising that one device could pay off huge dividends. So you just have to, we're going to have to evolve as a culture and figure out how to live with the technology and possibly understand that, again, there's risk with that.
So hopefully he either bought it from a good company or knows how to lock down that phone, because at some point somebody or everyone's going to eventually be hacked or breached.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, that's a great point. And I think that we've seen it specifically over the SolarWinds and the Exchange events that have unfolded over the last couple of months. In both of those events, and I'm sure your listeners are familiar with what I'm talking about, but The IT teams and individual organizations did everything right. They patched everything.
Mm-hmm.
They had their firewalls, they had their antiviruses, they had their SIEM systems, and they still got breached.
Yeah, they followed their compliance. They were compliant.
That's right. They were compliant. They did everything right, and they were still breached. Some of the best companies in the world, right? Microsoft and Mandiant. Some of these guys were culpable in this. I think it's important to notice that both government and industry were both impacted, despite their best efforts. So I don't think that the pursuit of profit or the pursuit of compliance spared anyone from that that series of events. And ultimately we've got to train like we fight, and we've got to prepare for the inevitable. We recently did a tabletop exercise, and I got some feedback from some of the people, and they're like, "Well, that's unrealistic. That wouldn't happen." Well, yeah, but we have to assume that will, right? Just like every bank can be robbed. It doesn't matter how many guards you have. It doesn't matter how many guns you have, how many cameras or alarm systems. If your adversary spends enough time and enough resources, they'll get what you have. And we just have to presuppose that that's going to happen and that we can respond. Because ultimately, Willie Sutton is credited with saying that, he was asked the question once, why do you rob banks? And his response was because that's where the money is. Right. Our information has value, and our information is desirable. And so people are going to come for it. Right. Why are we going to get hacked? Because that's where the information is, and that's where the money is. And we've seen the rise of ransomware. And for the most part, our industry has been very ineffective with dealing with ransomware, with entire segments of our population that just say, well, we've got cybersecurity insurance. That's kind of how they transfer that risk, right? Because they do the best they can, but you see it over and over again when you have conversations with people. They're like, well, we've got all the firewalls and we've got all the antivirus and we've got all the this and the that, but when it comes down to the end of the day, that's what we have insurance for. Well, that's a terrible answer.
And you mentioned adversary, and the adversary in the SolarWinds breach hack. It's like I always say, they have the most important thing. They've got time. They also have people, tons and tons of people, and of course they have money. But most of all, they have time. Who knows how long they've been sitting in there?
Right, absolutely, and who knows how long they're going to continue? Right,
correct.
And so I've been on the other side of the big door on the American efforts, and I can tell you that we are doing the exact same thing. We spend countless hours and countless resources, trying to further our nation's goals. And when we're talking about not just nation-state actors, but the barrier for entry into cyber is very, very low. You can spend a nominal amount of money in the grand scheme of things and develop some pretty robust capability. I read an article recently where someone was postulating that the pandemic had created a lack of good quality jobs for college graduates, so they were turning to ransomware instead. Where they're like, well, we got to earn a living. Let's find something that's lucrative, and they were turning to social engineering people and phishing campaigns, and the article was postulating that this gave rise to the ransomware as a service, where they just created the infrastructure, and now whoever wants it can go out and use it.
Interesting article.
Yeah, it's capitalism.
Yeah, that's true, right? All right, Jonathan, don't want to take any more of your time with your busy self. Thanks for stopping by.
Well, Nick, I appreciate it. And again, a fan of the show. I just recently discovered it, but went back and listened to several of your episodes, and quality product. And I really appreciate, the time and attention that you're putting into helping educate, not just information security professionals, but, the IT world in general. And it's an important voice, and it's an important message, and I appreciate it.
All right. And thanks for staying in sync with InfoSecSync.
Thanks, Nick.
That's it for this episode. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. And as always, thanks for staying in sync with InfoSecSync.